Good evening, everyone. My name is Kevin Fox. I'm the Assistant Director for the Albert Lepage Center for History and the Public Interest at Villanova University. The mission of the center is to create a more historically informed public, and to that end, we fund grants, fellowships, internships, partner with other organizations inside and outside of academia, and put on book talks and panel discussions like the one in which you're about to take part. You can learn more about us and our upcoming events on crisis moments and otherwise at lepage.villanova.edu or at LePageVU on Instagram and Blue Sky. You can write us for questions about our events and programs at lepage@villanova.edu. And if you would like to subscribe from updates about grant funding and events, we're putting the link to subscribe in the chat. So welcome to the first event in this year's series on crisis moments. Is there a higher education crisis? In just a moment, our moderator, Dr. Paul Steggy, will introduce our speakers and we'll begin. Paul Steggy is Associate Professor of History at Villanova University, where his research and teaching focused on 20th century Europe, history of everyday life, and the history of soccer. He is currently completing a book on everyday violence in 20th century Berlin. He also serves as secretary for the Villanova chapter of the American Association of University Professors. Dr. Steggy, take it away.
All right. Thank you very much, Kevin. It's a real honor to be part of this Lepage Center event, and I'm very excited to join all of the audience in learning from our distinguished panelists this evening. So just to give you a little bit of a heads up for the way in which this roundtable will work. So I'm going to introduce all three of the panelists to start things off, and then we'll go through in sequence, and they will make brief presentations of 10 minutes or so. In the order in which they are introduced. Then what we'll do is maybe give them a chance to respond to any revelations that have come out from the other panelists' remarks, and then we'll open up to a broader conversation to try to address any questions that you might have. You can use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen if you are so inclined, and please feel free to submit a question at any point in the process as soon as it strikes you in their comments. And we will try to address those over the course of the evening and respond to them in time. So again, please feel free to post your questions as soon as they strike you, and then we will try to introduce them to the panelists as we work our way through the discussion. All right, so I'm really excited about our three panelists. Just as I began to work my way through just a small portion of their scholarship and public-facing work, it is absolutely clear how much we all have to learn from them today, and I'm grateful for this opportunity. So to begin, Lauren Lesab-Shepard is a historian of American colleges and universities. She is the author of Resistance from the Right, Conservatives and the Campus Wars in Modern America, and co-editor of the forthcoming volume, Liberating the Campus. She is named by Diverse Issues in Higher Education as part of its class of 2024 Leading Women in the Field of Higher Education. Her work and commentary have been featured in the Chronicle of Higher Education, The Guardian, The New York Times, BBC News, Washington Post, The Atlantic, Time Magazine, NPR, Politico, Slate, Vox, The Nation, Teen Vogue, Jacobin, and other U.S. and international outlets. She also hosts the American Campus podcast, and I absolutely encourage you to check that out. Just going through the topic list of their recent podcasts is sort of a summary of critical issues facing higher education, and it's a great way to dive into the topic. Our second speaker this evening is Isaac Kamola. He is professor of political science at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. He is author of Free Speech and Coke Money, Manufacturing a Campus Culture War, and with Ralph Wilson, the author of Making the World Global, U.S. Universities and the Product of the Global Imaginary. He currently directs the Center for the Defense of Academic Freedom at the American Association of University Professors. Last, and certainly not least, Michael Berube is the Edwin Earl Sparks Professor of Literature at Penn State. He's the author of 12 books, including Public Access Literary Theory and American Cultural Politics, and Life as We Know It, A Father, a Family, and an Exceptional Child, as well as What's Liberal About the Liberal Arts. He's also edited a collection on higher education under fire, politics, economics, and the crisis of the humanities that came out in 1995, and he edited that along with Carrie Nelson. For the purpose of our session today, it is also worth highlighting his wide range of service with the AAUP, so the American Association of University Professors, the Modern Languages Association, of which he was president in 2012, and also his wide-ranging service in various forms of faculty governance at Penn State. With those introductions behind us, I'm very excited to begin with the content of our evening and to turn things over to Dr. Lesab Shepard, who will begin the conversation this evening.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much, Kevin and Paul and Christina, for all of your organizing work. I'm honored to be in conversation with you, with Isaac, Michael, and the entire Lepage community tonight. So our orienting question is there a crisis in higher education? And certainly higher education is under rhetorical and material attack, but I don't think that this is an existential crisis. We have 4,000 colleges and universities, so the system itself isn't going anywhere. And if we zoom out, the attacks of this moment are not just specific to higher education, right? What our schools, colleges, and libraries are facing is part of a broader attempt for our government to control culture and knowledge. So our colleges will outlive Trump 2.0. That's not to say they won't look very different on the other side, but they will survive. To the question of, is this fundamentally about a series of external attacks, or is this an internal collapse? I think the best way to conceive of what's happening now is to look at higher education within our larger political economy. So it's not inside out versus outside in at all. It is, what is our national consensus about what higher education is, and thus what it should do. And that larger national consensus that both of our parties and federal and state governments, and that our college administrators themselves insist on, is that colleges and universities are integral to the state and to the economy. And this has been the case since 1636 with the founding of Harvard, but it's been especially true since the 1930s. Since the New Deal, universities have been a key part of our liberal technocratic government. The academy has been crucial to the economy, to policy questions, and above all, the military, which keeps the US in its position of global dominance and has since the mid-century. And again, all of this has bipartisan support. Even conservatives who have historically opposed the New Deal liberal order and state spending have embraced military spending and investment, billions of dollars of which flow through our R1s, right? So looking at higher ed's function for the state and the national economy helps us know when it's in trouble with either or both of those things. And right now it is indeed in trouble with both. So let's talk about why we are in trouble with the state. If the state's prerogative under the Trump administration is to get rid of woke, then we're out of line. And I'll talk a little bit about wokeness in just a moment. But this has been true for every previous presidential administration, right? Same with civil rights protests under Eisenhower and Johnson, anti-Vietnam War activity under Nixon, anti-apartheid protests under Reagan, political correctness under Clinton, demonstrations after 9/11 under Bush, cancel culture under Biden, right? The historical examples of this are endless in the 20th and 21st century. The state wants colleges to offer job training and solve economic and military problems and say thank you. So I don't see this so much as external attack versus internal collapse, but more of a continuity of what always happens to institutions that are not independent from the state when the state itself is in crisis. Now, how does thinking about whether these attacks are focused on the Ivies or our community colleges or K-12, how does that shape our understanding of things? I would say that the Ivies and R1s always make headlines, especially when it comes to moral panics around, cancel culture, wokeness. And those imaginations sort of project down onto K-12 and out across to state schools and community colleges. Depictions of the typical college campus are usually pretty farcical, right? And that doesn't matter if the reporting comes from Fox News or from the New York Times. The fantasy is that college students are wealthy radicals, and I might add for the right, class traitors. And so what they imagine about K-12 teachers is similarly farcical, right? Apparently they're administering hormones and teaching kids to use litter boxes or something. So in navigating this moment, we need to remember who the administration thinks it's fighting, which is just as important as reality because it's their reality and they are in power. Anyone who's spent time on a college campus knows that the gender studies department doesn't run the entire institution, and that is for better or for worse. If you spent time on K-12 campuses or at a local library, you know that the teachers and the librarians tend to look a lot like the neighbors in the communities in which they're situated. So again, our educational system, unfortunately, is nowhere near as woke as the Trump administration and what establishment media seems to think that it is. So again, a big part of our job is not to accept the hyperbolic descriptions about who our students are and who our faculty are and what work goes on in our classrooms, because those exaggerations feed into a MAGA playbook and they hinder our ability to build solidarity with each other. Right. So we're all doing the same job, and that is teaching and learning. We all have the same enemy to resist, and that's anyone who would stop us from teaching and learning. How to explain the chronology of this crisis. So the academy was in crisis before Trump 2.0, even before Trump 1.0. And the attacks against culture and education will continue after Trump because the MAGA movement exceeds Donald Trump, man. As I have written about before, the American right has kept education in its crosshairs for well over 100 years. The same as it has with the media, the law, the entertainment industry. Education, like those, is sort of considered a fifth column. And that's true for all authoritarians, right? We've seen that throughout history and throughout the world. So in a way, the good thing is that none of this is new. It might have 21st century features and there might be unique American circumstances, but the larger authoritarian struggle to conquer culture is pretty well trod. So we know what authoritarians do. We know what does work to resist them. We also know what doesn't work. Things like obeying in advance, which we've seen many college administrators do. But what does work is alliances and mutual aid and general organizing and fighting back. So how does my discipline of history inform what constitutes this crisis? So I'll speak first as a historian about the MAGA movement, and then the ed historian in me will apply that to our colleges. So the discipline of history would say that Trump and the MAGA movement are not exceptional at all. Trump is no aberration. He's the logical conclusion of a political economic system that doesn't work for people. Our system of rules and laws has been historically designed to benefit the wealthy, especially propertied white men. But from the New Deal in the 30s until the social upheavals of the 60s, we did have an economy that worked a little bit better for working class people, but those 30 years were exceptional. Right? Since the 70s, both political parties have abandoned the working class. They've embraced neoliberalism. And so there's been bipartisan support in sawing away social protections in favor of market principles. And the university is tied up in that game. So, we've thrown out class politics instead. We have culture wars to argue about. That gives us Trump, this pseudo-populist who is more in the bag of the wealthy than perhaps any of his base cares to admit, but he plays well into culture wars. So how is he not an aberration? You can't read US history and not see how groups of Americans have always lived under authoritarian conditions. How is Trump not a departure from Jim Crow, for example? You can't read Indigenous history, look at the Indian Removal Act, the Trail of Tears, and say that Trump is an aberration. Same with the Chinese Exclusion Act. We've had concentration camps of Japanese Americans on US soil. We have a concentration camp right now, actually at Guantanamo Bay. So there's no way that you can take an honest look at US history, the presidencies of Andrew Johnson or Andrew Jackson, and say that Donald Trump doesn't fit that lineage, right? You can look at the Fugitive Slave Act and see today's ICE immigration raids, unfortunately. So the difference is white middle-class Americans are now living under conditions that other Americans have always experienced. And suddenly we want to call it fascism as if it's a European import and not a homegrown American tradition. So what does all of that have to do with the academy? Again, if you look at our colleges and universities within that national story, we can understand the role that they play with the state and when they're out of favor, right? So they're associated with culture wars, even though we know our campuses are pretty mild spaces most of the time. But it is true that our colleges do exacerbate class differences. It's only been in the recent past that they've helped poorer students move up the class scale, and now a degree actually keeps poorer students in poverty because of student loans. Same thing with our faculty. 75% of us are either employed contingently, pay dependents, have no health insurance or retirement savings. Even tenured faculty have pretty little say in institutional governance. How did we get here? Again, higher education as an institution follows the market logics of the state, right? It follows neoliberalism and envisions higher education as a private good rather than a public one. So the way that we under Trump 2.0 see our STEM faculty being treated right now, with their research funding being cut and their expertise being called into question, that is how the humanities have been treated for decades under neoliberalism. Tenured faculty are at risk of being terminated. That's how we've treated our adjuncts and our graduate students for decades. So again, just like with the lineage of the Fugitive Slave Act and today's ICE raids, none of this is unprecedented. It's just that the pains of the academy are now being felt by people who never imagined that they would be treated this way. I don't know how I'm doing on time. Do I have time to make one final point, Kevin?
Yes, you have time, plenty of time. Yep.
Okay. All right. So I'll say one final thing. Final provocation. I'm interested, especially in what my co-panelists think. I've been thinking about the way that our tech billionaires are so entrenched in the Trump administration. At least under Donald Trump's administration, it might be possible that the federal government doesn't really need the research university anymore, and neither will the tech industry, because the VCs seem to have more control within their own spaces than over universities. In fact, something that they all joke about, like a point of pride for them, is being accepted into and then dropping out of an Ivy League without a degree, an Ivy League institution. And they now work with the government directly to develop surveillance, right, to sell us things. In turn, the federal government doesn't really need the universities for militarism the way it did during the Cold War. Palantir and BlackRock, Alphabet, Meta, and soon TikTok, it looks like, are going to be more important than Harvard or MIT and Stanford to Trump and to Silicon Valley. So I'd be interested to hear anyone else's thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So our next speaker is Isaac Kamola. I'll just turn things over to you and let you continue with your remarks.
Hey, thanks, Paul, for convening us, and for Kevin and Christina for organizing us, and thanks to Lauren and Michael. It's really a great honor and a pleasure to be on this panel with two scholars whose work I greatly admire and who have been clear advocates, both intellectually in their writing and also in their activism for higher education. I think, is there a crisis of higher education? I think the answer is clearly yes. And I think, too, that there's a way of thinking about the crisis. I totally agree with what Lauren just put on the table. This is not a crisis of Trump. I think that's a huge mistake to assume that we are in this current moment because of one buffoonish man who has taken on an attack on higher education. And in fact, I think it's really important, and Lauren said all this in a similar way, is to think that the history of American higher education has always been about the reproduction of hierarchy, the reproduction of patriarchy, the reproduction of capital, the reproduction of white supremacy. And that actually, when we talk about a university under siege and a university that's under attack, what we really have in mind is some quintessential mid-20th century university, large publics, that were available to vast swaths of Americans, first generation students, immigrants, women, students of color who found themselves in college universities for relatively free. Your grandfather saying, when I was a kid, I worked over the summer and I went to high school and I became a banker, right? Like that is the vision of the university that is now currently in crisis. And I think it's really important that we situate that, what's sometimes called the golden age, although that's a misnomer because of course, it also reproduced its own hierarchies, as Lauren noted, was heavily invested in the war machine, was heavily invested in the American imperial project, and was also deeply exclusionary. But in some moment, there was a way of seeing a university that was more accessible, that was affordable. And I think it's really important, as Roderick Ferguson does in his book, We Demand, to make it very clear that a university that was more equitable, if you think about Piketty's curve, right, you can kind of think of higher education in the same way, right, where the education that was more equal, that was less hierarchical, was a result of massive political protest, right, organizing of students, civil rights, anti-war, third world movements, feminist movements, queer movements, a bunch of social movements pushing the institution to live up to the values of a multiracial democracy and to a more equitable society. And at each point, the university was resisting such changes, right? And it was through hard work and organizing and unions and grassroots movements, radical protests, intellectual work, student occupations, right? That led to a university that we're now claiming is the university, right? But it was actually a moment of exception that was created through political power and political organizing, right? The legacy of that university, I think it's helpful to think about that Roger Ferguson also points out is that as soon as you get an institution that's more equitable, right, in terms of more demographically diverse, you also get an institution that's more epistemologically diverse, right? New populations of people finding themselves in the institutions or forcing themselves into the institutions and then demanding that those institutions represent their experiences and then also producing the knowledge of that tells their stories, histories, cultures, and literatures and art and knowledges, right? And that epistemic transformation of the university, um, as it always includes a backlash, right? Because again, as Lauren pointed to, the kind of deep reactionary sentiment in American politics is doesn't stop or go away, or we're not on some moral arc, but rather in a constant kind of competition over or a struggle over what the university is. So I think that it's helpful now too to kind of think about that longer history, but to think about kind of I think it's useful to say that there's two there's two stories about what higher education is, right? On the one hand, you know, there's almost 5,000 institutions around the United States, everything from community colleges to Harvard to small liberal arts to regional state schools to large R1 flagship institutions to just an incredible number of different types of institutions that almost 5,000 institutions that therefore probably have 100,000 classes or more taught on any given day, right? With tens of thousands of speakers being hosted, and the vast majority of those classes are people going about their everyday work of learning, of teaching, of research, of going to department meetings and sitting on committees and overseeing dissertations and reading books and trying to find time to write articles um, and meeting with students and advising and arguing with administrators, complaining about students who don't read enough, students engaging in all the things that students engage in, which include study, but also sports and activities and protest and falling in love and all of the things that happens on a college campus, and all of that is pretty normal and typical. And I think that it's really important that that real university, the university that actually exists, as Lauren also points out, is in crisis, right? It's too expensive. There's $1.6 trillion in student debt. The political economy of higher education has been fundamentally transformed to turn students into indebted subjects and future workers who will be leveraged and indentured in a way for their entire life. That you have that higher education is not accessible. The size of the community college system is the same size as it was in the 70s, even though there's a greater demand for community colleges than ever before. And so you have fewer and fewer people who are able to access higher education. It becomes increasingly expensive, and as a result, you there's a disenchantment with university. It's really easy to turn higher education into the enemy if it's seen as something that only a few people, if it's seen as a scarce resource that only a few people have access to, or that people take on with great burden. That's a way of saying that the real university, the university that actually exists in every day, is in crisis. However, there's another university, and this is the university that exists in the fever mind of the right wing, right? Which is also what Lauren alluded to, which is the university that is woke, that's indoctrinating students, that's hostile to conservative views, where every time there's a speaker, they're shouted down in a heckler's veto, and that the students are radical libs who are trying to convert and pollute the minds of America, who are destroying America, who are out to get America, who are engaged in massive civil rights abuses because of their efforts to diversify campus, or in shorthand, what J.D. Vance called faculty as the enemy, right? That university does not exist, right? That university is a fever dream. And I would say it's a multi-decade moral panic, or if you want to use stronger language, psychological warfare, some sort of psyop that, and I've written about this in a number of places, so I won't go into the full argument here, that a number of very, very well-resourced student groups, professional provocateurs, think tanks, political operatives, media outlets, legal outlets have spent considerable amount of resources and organization in order to manufacture a narrative to create the university and in that second image, right? The university that does not exist, right? But it only exists in this fever mind of the moral panic. And so I think that is really important to think about what that vision of the moral panic about the state of higher education gets us, because I think that it gets us to a place where the attacks on higher education, I think, are more existential than what Lauren puts on the table. And for this, I'm just borrowing from Ellen Schrecker, the foremost scholar of McCarthyism in the United States, or in higher education, in American higher education. Ellen wrote the book on McCarthyism in higher education, and recently in 2023, so pre-Trump, said that the current state of higher education is worse than under McCarthyism. And the reason why it's worse is because under McCarthyism, faculty, and 100 plus faculty, were fired, but they were fired because of their political affiliation. Right. So the university was able to kind of continue and go on while individuals were being fired, harassed, and pushed out of the university. But what's at stake now is this image, this fever dream image of higher education is being used as a justification for political operatives who have an ideological project to fundamentally transform the knowledge that gets produced within the university. And true, there has always been external pressure. There have always been efforts by fossil fuel companies and political operatives and the church who are opposed to the teaching of evolution, and any number of examples of efforts to fundamentally transform the knowledge and teaching and research that takes place within higher education. But we're seeing it now at a level where, and I'll just leave it with this, that the example of the compact, I think, is kind of the hyperbolic example of the future that the current administration sees, right? Where universities give over all of their autonomy and basically say, the federal government, you have the ability to determine whether we have international students and how much, whether we have certain departments or what, or not, if we have access to federal grants, if we have access to student loan money. And in exchange, in exchange for having all the things that we currently have by law, we will give over to the federal government, to political operatives in some unspecified way, carte blanche ability to fundamentally transform our how things are taught, what content is taught, and all of that. And I think that that's fundamentally different than past attacks on higher education. I think is quite existential. I think Lauren's point about the tech billionaires is really important. I think that we should take that up in the conversation. But I think it's also important to think of Trumpism as not, you know, an individual. But I think I think what we're seeing now is a crisis of the state, but it's also very seriously a crisis of capitalism. And it's a crisis of political economy. As a political economist, you know, a crisis of political economy in which the extremities, the extreme inequality is so great that that the university itself is, you cannot have public goods, be them universities or otherwise. You cannot have, you know, free spaces of knowledge. You cannot have people who value teaching and research in a situation in which you have plutocratic control over the economy and therefore over politics as well. So.
Thank you very much. I've been frantically scribbling down my notes. I'm really excited about all that we have to talk about. And so I will get out of the way again and let Professor Barabay have his word.
Yes, well, I've been frantically scribbling as well for going last. Usually I have the benefit of alphabetical order or something like that. But I'm going to repeat some points that have already been made. And I want to thank Christina and Kevin and you for putting this together. It's an honor to be on this panel with people whose work I admire so much. So I have to say that especially earnestly because I'm going to open by disagreeing with Lauren, which is not something I anticipated. I'm going to try to do it very carefully because I thought her analysis was spot on, and her closing question about the role of tech billionaires is something I have not considered. And so anything I say on that subject is going to be really off the top of my head, but I'll leave that, as Isaac suggested, we leave that for maybe the second round. But it's a great, great point. I think I have an answer, but I'll let it sit for a couple of minutes. So the first thing I want to do by disagreeing with Lauren is to agree with her. This didn't come out of nowhere. The answer to your question, the panel question, is higher education in crisis. Isaac says yes. I would say it's more like hell yes, and in some ways like never before. And now here's where I qualify that. The fever dream that Isaac and Lauren spoke of has been going on for about 75 years at least. It dates to 1951. The usual citation is William Buckley's God and Man at Yale. A really cheeky and amazingly bold statement from a 24-year-old recent graduate that basically said the alumni should be taking over Yale because it is indoctrinating people into communism and atheism. Yale, this would be Yale we're talking about. So, in fact, there's a one point at which Buckley even chastises one of his professors who's teaching an Old Testament class for not having enough Christian insights. Okay, well, that never went away. And a couple of years ago, when I reread God and Man at Yale, and then I found out what they did in Florida as a result, they created this Johns Commission that went to root out communists in Florida. Well, they didn't find any, so they went after homosexuals instead. It's a weird sort of continuous undercurrent of the last 75 years that these attacks have also been, had this really strong vein of homophobia. And now that's taken a really deadly twist with anti-trans activism as well. So yes, there's a precedent for this. I would also say this, in 1980, I sometimes shock people under 30 by quoting them the tuition at Berkeley in 1980, $300. Out of state, $360. That was $360. Bill Bennett, who used to be the Secretary of Education under Reagan, once went on his radio show to complain about people getting PhDs in philosophy. He got his PhD in philosophy from the University of Texas in 1965, when tuition was free. This, as Lauren suggested, has been a bipartisan affair since 1980. The redefinition of higher education as, instead of being a public good, being a private investment of individuals and their families, plunking down their money in the hopes of greater earnings throughout the rest of their lives. I think the word neoliberal is horribly overused and has been for a decade and is probably very tired, but this is exactly what neoliberalism is: the redefinition of public goods as private investments. That is what it is. And American universities have really been Exhibit A. So that's another moment, right, that led us to where we are. The third thing is where I came in. Now seems so many years ago, 35 years ago. The so-called PC crisis, political correctness, the backlash against woke, the backlash against Me Too. It's basically PC 2.0. Some of the same talking points still survive. There's still a strong undercurrent of homophobia. Excuse me. And again, this fever dream that these campuses are cooking up radical, intolerant. One actually, Newsweek called it the new McCarthyism, even though there were no firings and there was no McCarthy. So that moral panic has also persisted for quite some time. And if you're talking about things going back to the early 90s, to 1980, to 1945, and I think Lauren said even a little bit before, if you go back to the 30s, obviously you can't speak of a crisis, right? There's no such thing as a crisis that lasts a century. That said, I do think we are in an existentially threatening moment for universities. Lauren is right that most of them will survive. And I think if you look around now, the ones that are most exempt from the depredations of this administration are the small liberal arts colleges, partly because they don't have enormous research expenditures and they can't be squeezed in that way. However, they're also some of the most expensive institutions in the country. So, Michael Roth, the president of Wesleyan, can be a strong advocate, a strong leader of the resistance. Leon Botstein at Bard. But again, these are some pretty elite institutions, and seeing that as like the future of higher education does not answer those questions about accessibility. But what I want to focus on, I'm going to go back to something that a word that Isaac threw out that I think is absolutely fundamental: autonomy, the intellectual autonomy of universities. We have never seen an assault of this nature. And I think his citation of Ellen Schrecker is right as well. McCarthyism went after individuals, and it went after individuals for their political beliefs. The last 10 years have seen attacks on entire fields of study. Ellen Schrecker is right about that. And the attempt, for example, led first by Christopher Rufo, to make up something called critical race theory that they had no knowledge of and no interest in learning about. And just at one point, Rufo actually put out a series of tweets. We're just going to take anything we want and call it critical race theory, and we're going to tarnish its brand. And part of me admires that commitment to telling people, I am going to lie to you repeatedly. And just, this is a part of Trumpism, right? Saying the quiet part out loud. So here's where I was a couple of years ago. I published a couple essays, nothing in major, in higher ed publications. I'm not sure how many people outside universities read them, but I was thinking about what Ron DeSantis was doing in Florida. The Don't Say Gay bill, Stop Woke Act, and then another piece of legislation which didn't get a lot of attention, but for which Isaac and I both served as expert witnesses. Part of that legislation involved annual surveys of viewpoint diversity, and most dangerously allowed students or anyone to videotape classes. And even though there was a provision that they should not be put on the internet, I had to believe that anyone who wrote that provision either doesn't know how the internet works or doesn't care. Because obviously you can upload a thing from a cafe anonymously, and the damage is done without any potential for remediation. So that's what I thought. I thought the future was Florida. I thought that, especially in red states, and especially with regard to public education, we would see a concerted effort by red state governors and their lickspittles and their minions, including Christopher Rufo now, to dismantle places like the New College of Florida, which was the liberal arts jewel in the public higher education crown in Florida. And what they did with the new college was basically destroy it. They fired the president, they hired a political crony at a much higher salary, because that's part of how MAGA works also. So you got corruption, you got waste of taxpayer funds, and then they decided to make it less liberal and less woke, to bring in a bunch of baseball players, even though they did not have a baseball field. So yeah, the incompetence together with the commitment to things like, college baseball as opposed to the liberal arts. I thought, yeah, that's where MAGA world is going. And certain discussions would be banned. Anything having to do with race, gender, and sexuality. Books would be removed from libraries, and all things DEI would be declared illegal, including the very insights of critical race theory that say this kind of thing goes on in white backlash. I mean, it is cold comfort to critical race theorists that their work is being borne out by the people who don't know anything about it but seek to outlaw it. Well, I also figured that, as my co-panelists have already mentioned, higher education is not alone in this. Lauren mentioned also the entertainment industry, the media, anything that eludes complete cultural capture by the right. And of course, they've never been friends of the arts and humanities. It is, I am old enough to remember when there were actual political conservatives who cared about the arts and humanities. I just don't see it anymore. I just don't see that it's on their radar in any way. That they've basically ceded the ground of all types of human cultural expression. They're just not interested in it. It doesn't maximize shareholder value. It doesn't own the libs, so it's not their business anymore. So I assumed that something bad would happen to the National Endowment for the Humanities, and it did. I assumed that the arts and humanities, especially, again, anything dealing with race, gender, and sexuality, or difficult moments in American or global history, that would be under attack. Yeah, but I underestimated how bad things would be. The actuality we're living under is worse. Okay, first of all, we're dealing on the federal level. We are not talking about state by state Trump wannabes like DeSantis or Greg Abbott in Texas doing the worst they possibly can. But almost nobody had on the bingo card attacks on federally funded research for things like pediatric cancer and Alzheimer's. These are not culture war items. These are not ideologically fraught, terrains here. Pediatric cancer, or any form of cancer, any form of scientific research. But people like, I think, Russell Vought and the architects of Project 2025 realized, and they were not wrong, that if you really want to squeeze universities, the big ones, the major research universities, go after the sciences, kill their funding. Now, of course, those killings of fundings were illegal. They had no basis in American law or constitutional history. Congress, as we know, thanks to Mike Johnson, has basically ceded the power of the purse altogether. Hello. And excuse me. Where am I? And then they've also managed to weaponize backlash. Sorry, I'm getting back. Thank you. Weaponize backlash to the campus demonstrations that were largely in defense of the people of Gaza. They took many forms, but overwhelmingly these were protests against what many people now consider genocide in Gaza. And we have the really grotesque development in the last year of having full campaigns against anti-Semitism, sometimes led by actual Nazis. So obviously protection of actual Jewish students is not really the issue. Squeezing Columbia University is. Again, we have seen attacks before, and some of these have been abiding for decades. But this sort of direct federal assault is new. A couple of years ago also, I thought, well, in response to Florida, what could you do about something devastating like what happened to the New College of Florida? I thought maybe the last line of defense was accreditors. I mean, at some point, the New College of Florida is just not a real college anymore. And it shouldn't pass muster with accreditors. And I did not anticipate that either, that I'd be looking to accrediting agencies as the last line of defense. They tend to be bean counting administrative outlets that have never cared, for example, about the crisis in faculty employment and the fact that 3/4 of us are off the tenure track, many people not even working for a living wage. Not their concern. They're concerned with like student outcomes or what have you. But I thought maybe accreditation might be something that we could turn to draw a line in the sand and say, at this point, this thing is not a university anymore. Well, that has not escaped MAGA's notice either. And now what we're seeing is attacks on accreditors and attempts to create alternative, MAGA-friendly accrediting agencies to close that door and once more undermine the intellectual autonomy and the legitimacy of American higher education. All right. Where is I going to go with this? Excuse me. Nowhere good, of course. Oh, right, of course. The other word, Isaac already mentioned it, the compact. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of the compact. Isaac sketched out some of them, control over the number of international students, control over certain areas of study, control over compliance with various executive orders, none of which have any real standing either. So far, no takers. But there have been two think pieces in the Chronicle of Higher Education arguing that this compact is an opportunity for universities to rebuild public trust and negotiate in good faith with the Trump administration. And I have to wonder if the authors of those essays have been lying in a coma for the last 10 years, because I cannot imagine any rational person at this moment in history, in the year of our Lord 2025, thinking that the Trump administration is an honest bargaining partner. I don't have words. Yes, and he also said he wouldn't touch the East Wing. I just don't know what does it take at this point for people to realize that if his mouth is moving, he's lying. So quite apart, even if the terms of the compact were lovely and nothing but puppies and dolphins and support for the arts and humanities, they wouldn't be worth the water they're written on. So I'm hoping that that saner heads will prevail. The squishy institutions so far seem to be, unfortunately, Washington University in St. Louis, my firstborn's alma mater, and Vanderbilt seem to be open to. The word is that WashU will not sign the compact. We've heard that from a dean. I'm not sure it has the imprimatur of the president, but look, the first time someone agrees to that compact is itself an existential crisis. If you've seen the way Trump deals with major corporations like ABC, CBS, and their various corporate owners, the agreement to one demand only leads to further demands, and that goalpost will never stop moving. So this too is something well beyond anything we saw in McCarthyism, in PC, in the culture wars to date. This is a direct frontal assault. And I think that element of it warrants the word crisis. Thank you.
Thank you so much to our three panelists who have certainly given us a great deal to think about. So I did promise each of you the chance to weigh in at this initial stage, if both Isaac and Michael have to some extent posed some questions to Laura, and there have been some questions in circulation a little bit. So maybe I'll just kind of open up the floor if any of you want to respond. There have been a number of questions that have been submitted from the audience as well, but maybe we'll give you a first chance to react if anything has been generated out of the remarks so far.
So I don't mean to imply that higher education is not in crisis, just that it's not in an existential crisis. And I do think that higher ed as such will survive Trump 2.0. It'll just look different. To Michael's point about conservatives not caring about arts and humanities, I'll push back on that just a little bit. Conservatives actually love arts and humanities. They just have a version of it that they want to have projected, right? And it's usually this traditional great books. It's lots of like classical British literature and literally classical, like ancient Greece and Roman ideas and thought. And it doesn't include any French theorists. So that's the version that they want to put forward. I have tons of notes. I mean, there's so much.
I just think they're dying from the earth. That's right. That is the sort of Alan Bloom model, and I'm almost nostalgic for it. I mean, at this point, I'm like, if you're interested in antiquity at all, you get some points. But yeah, you're right. I'll take the point.
There's another question too, and I can't remember what prompted this, but the note that I wrote down, I'm just going to go from that. I do want to point out that in the case of New College, it's sort of easy to go after a place like New College because it's public, right? It's not private. It doesn't have lots of independence, and it doesn't have the alumni base of like a University of Florida or a Florida State with their major athletic programs, who would be mad if, you know, the state came in and started tinkering with the ongoings of their alma mater. So I think in a way, New College was a really easy target. I also, to the point about cuts to things like childhood cancer. Yeah, you're right. That's totally not a culture wars thing, but I think it comes from a place of the administration thinking that everything needs to be privatized, and that is what they want for all of higher education. And I've had people tell me that that's wrong, that higher ed is a good mix of public and private. And what I would say to that is, look at K-12, right? Look at the push for the voucher system in K-12. They can't do that to higher education because higher education exists structurally different than K-12. But it is the goal, I think. Okay, that's enough for me. I'll let somebody else talk.
Actually, let me, if I can, take that baton and run with it a bit, because your closing point about the tech billionaires is very generative, and I'll be thinking about it for quite some time. So here's my initial thoughts. When I stare into the abyss, what I see is fantasies about AI, and you're right that in Magus fever dreams, everything would be privatized. There'd be no public investment in pediatric research or anything else, pediatric cancer research or anything else. I'm not sure it's a priority of the Peter Thiels of the world. I'm not, or the Sam Altmans. I think they are banking, well, literally, on AI somehow realizing all their weirdest desires, and the electrical grid be damned, and that all other questions about research, about even medical research, get run through that. That's my sense, but it's an uninformed sense. It's just a sort of layman's take on where the billionaires are coming from. I don't think, in other words, they don't have a model to put in place for a new model of pediatric cancer research. What they do have is a lot of really bizarre and toxic fantasies about AI.
I think that's absolutely right, and I think the story of Mark Rowan, I think, is particularly helpful here, right? Where being on the board of trustees, hedge fund billionaire on the board of trustees at UPenn, and after McGill's testimony in front of Congress, really ran the push to get her fired from the presidency, and released a memo basically saying, here's all the things that UPenn should be doing, right, in order to change its admissions, to make it less interested in diversity, to do all of these priorities that were basically kind of turning UPenn under the guidance of like a radical libertarian hedge fund notion. And this is the same like vision of free speech that these people have too, right? That a campus should be a place that is not about vetting ideas, not saying, no, you're wrong, or, hey, student, that may be your opinion, but it's not backed up by the literature. Let's move through the actual arguments in this field, right? It's not about that. It's about saying, everybody can say whatever they want, unregulated, no, and that vision, right, is very conducive if you're a tech billionaire who can fund speech on campus, right? So if the climate scientists all say that climate change is man-made, and you can say, well, it's my valid opinion that it's not, right? And here's all of the people on campus who, because you give funders ultimate access to higher education, then they can produce whatever knowledge is in their best interest. So this real desire to like break down the real kind of institutional idiosyncrasies of higher education that make it this like particularly weird kinds of institution, right? Where it's kind of fragmented and pitted against itself and kind of in all these different kinds of kind of interlocking, but kind of in competition, administrators, students, faculty, disciplines, different kinds of knowledge, all that weirdness that makes the university, that makes it really hard to kind of control what's going on. So if you want your humanities to be telling that great white man version of American history, you can't, because those ideas have been vetted out of history, right? Because they're bad, false arguments, right? So instead, if you could use the sledgehammer of either the state government or the federal government to say, no, you got to teach this. You got to teach Hillsdale version of American history, not the version of American history that 99% of the scholars who attend the American Historical Association take as their starting position, right? And then I think that it's also really important that Mark Rowan was also the lead architect of the compact, right? That this idea of kind of using the sledgehammer of the federal government to turn universities into differently regulated institutions, I think is really important. That there's this diabolical, narcissistic hedge fund reality they want to impose on the universities, and it can't because of the strangeness of the institution. But they are trying their damnedest, and they might
One
just.
quick footnote, and then you touched on something that I did not mention, but from reading anything out of it, that Jennifer Ruth and Jennifer at Portland State, have been arguing for the last couple of years that what we've seen is a conflation of free speech. First of all, a libertarian idea of free speech and a conflation of free speech with academic freedom. They are not the same thing at all, which is why we titled our book, It's Not Free Speech. But you're right that one of the things, one of the aspects of the attack involves removing the vetting processes that provide the ground for academic freedom so that we can distinguish ideas that have merit from those that do not. At the same time, over in the free speech realm, we have a new free speech martyr for whom free speech meant the right to go around talking about how Black women don't have the intellectual brain processing power to take jobs that should go to white men. Excuse me. So we've got a really, I think those two toxic developments have led to the opening for the sort of tech hedge fund billionaire imagining of higher education as a libertarian paradise in which anything goes, so long as they are able to underwrite and support it. Their version of free speech.
Can I just jump in? And I'm going to kind of pick up on something that just was introduced, and hopefully use that as a way to segue into some of the questions that are percolating up from the audience, and that is to think about kind of the power of boards of trustees and their ability to shape university governance, and part of this goes to a very early question that somebody raised about kind of the tension between internal and external pressures on the university, and the tendency of universities and university administrations to comply in advance. And maybe if I could put a slightly different spin on that as well, is as much as we've been talking about these different forces or individuals or organizations that are attacking universities or attacking our idealized version of the universities, are there any friends of the universities? Or are there any friends to university professors or university students? And I'm not entirely sure if the friends of the university professors are necessarily the friends of the universities, and that maybe is another question. But maybe this is a way of thinking about this question of internal versus external pressures is, well, who is around fighting for this version of a university that is under assault from board of trustees, or is being surrendered in advance, or is going to being undermined by this proposed compact?
I guess I'll take a stab at this, and I'll use it to answer two questions in the chat. So yes, I think the first thing that we need to be very clear about is that our universities are governed by appointed rather than elected trustees. Like you just mentioned, they're often hedge fund managers, private equity investors, tax attorneys, mega donor alumni. They have degrees from some of the nation's most inaccessible schools, and their chief concerns are the endowment's bottom line and their reputation, and not defending students' right to dissent against the government or private industries that bequeath them with billions of dollars. So yes, we should be very clear about who's actually running these places. Like I said earlier, it's not the gender studies program. I'm going to use that to segue into the first question tonight, which was about elaborating the idea about the crisis being external versus internal. I mean, are the trustees external or internal because they act in a way that satisfies external powers, not internal ones? To the question of who are the friends of the universities, I mean, we have excellent organizations. We've got AAUP representation here tonight. There's all sorts of union organizing, graduate student organizing. But I think the way that those alliances and those solidarities work is that the people who are most secure, so our tenured faculty, have to be the ones speaking out. And then this is to answer another question in the chat about how can faculty and academic communities push back against anticipatory compliance? I mean, it's like assuring people who are afraid to speak out because maybe they might be fired, that there is someone speaking out, right? Like someone securely can do that for them, and then they can join as part of a chorus. They don't have to stick their neck out first. Again, I want to go back to the question about, is this internal or external? And the reason that I don't see it, the conflict that way, I think it's the wrong way to look at it, because what follows from that paradigm is that the solution is that we just have to fix one or the other. We have to fix the external or the internal, or maybe even both. And we miss the larger problem, which is that the college is not independent from the state and the market. So whatever turbulences those things experience, the institution will too. I mean, Michael hinted at some of the freest institutions right now are slacks, and that's totally true. But then that poses a whole new problem about access and equity. So again, that's enough for me.
And I think that's totally consistent with the libertarian idea, right? Like, is that if very, very elite institutions are the places that you can go for the liberal arts, then that's exactly the goal, right? If you have time and money and leisure, then you can take on a study of philosophy as a luxury item, just like a Maserati or some other good that you think that you find utility in, right? But I mean, it's scary the way that DeSantis is talking about the university, that what goes on in the classroom should be subject to the interest of the state. And the state should be able to say, teaching this kind of thing is not in the interest of the state, and therefore this discipline should not exist. I mean, that's the logic that's at work here, is that the university becomes purely functional, right? And I think that, Chris Newfield's book, The Unmaking the Public University, just makes that argument that the culture war, with political correctness and kind of intensifying only since, has been about delegitimizing the university so you can defund it, going back to this idea of the role of this kind of radical libertarian ideology. But I also think, going back to the queasiness around, but accuracy of the term neoliberalism, we're also at that moment where that vision of the economy and those policies that have been put in place to try to fulfill that like fantasy la la land, right, of an economy that works independent of the state, right? That is fiction. Even classical economists now agree that that is fiction, right? And yet it is becoming pushed on policy as the big turd of a bill that was passed a few months ago, right? That there's people who are deeply committed to that fanciful idea of the economy and the effects of decades of that austerity, not only in higher education, but of course we're seeing it in higher education, but in all of public life, is leading to catastrophic offenses, like real human despair, real shorter life. I mean, the richest country in the world is experiencing a decline in life expectancy, right? Because of these economic policies that treat human life not in a dignified way, but in terms of as a commodity and as a self that's actualizing utility, right? And it has created real policies, destroyed safety nets, devoured and cannibalized institutions, destroyed norms, broken laws in order to create a kind of world that can never, ever, ever exist. And the reason why is that capitalism itself is in crisis, right? That they cannot find value in any place other than these crazy bubbles, be it crypto or AI, or before that housing and before that .com, right? These kinds of boom and bust cycles in which there's nothing there, right? Except hype, pump and dump, hype, pump and dump, and think that they can use that as a model for how to run all institutions. I'm just thinking Doge here, right? That you can run the federal government as a scam economy, right? And I think that capitalism is in crisis. The university has increasingly become central to, I mean, it's actually producing real value in an economy, and therefore has to be kind of preyed upon and predated against. And I think that, part of what it means to defend higher education, I think, is also to defend a notion of public goods, a role of radical redistribution at a planetary scale, and not be ashamed to say this world in which billionaires exist, much less billionaires at the level of Andreessen or Rowan or Elon Musk. It's a policy choice. That's what Piketty tells us. It's a policy choice. We don't have to make those choices. And we could have a world in which everybody could have a university education if they want it. And I think that a lot of that solves the economic crisis, and also everything that follows from that. I think that at this point I'm not afraid to kind of think at that scale.
Why not?
Radical distribution at a planetary scale. The vision that the libertarians are pushing on us is even more absurd, right? It's even more absurd to imagine a completely unregulated market in which everything balances out to the means and everybody lives in perfect freedom and prosperity. I mean, that is more absurd than radical redistribution at a planetary scale. So we should demand nothing less.
I want to go back. Thanks also for addressing some of the questions in the chat. I want to come back also to the internal and external question that kicked off those questions, because it's undoubtedly, especially when you ask questions about the boards of trustees, it's clear that sometimes the call is coming from inside the house, right? So you go back to 1995, as I do, with Lynn Cheney founding the American Council of Trustees and Alumni. It never really went anywhere. It didn't really catch on, but the idea was to run end around. They knew they just couldn't institute mass firings of PC faculty. So let's put pressure on. Let's go back to Buckley's idea of having the alumni run the joint, but let's also bring in the trustees. Now, again, I don't want to suggest that this just died on the vine. The ACTA still exists. I remember debating its Ann Neal when she was running the joint about 15 years ago. And they attempted something like this in Virginia before Virginia the University of Virginia was in Trump's sights. In 2012, I believe they they fired the then president, Teresa Sullivan, simply so that the Board of Visitors of UVA could demonstrate that they could do it. There wasn't an actual issue. And that, there was outcry and it got reversed. But yeah, this has always been a pressure point that is really neither external or internal, but both. It's like, Schrodinger's cat trustees. So I think that's it's a live issue, and something that we will see played out, especially on those boards that stock themselves with venture capitalists and hedge fund managers and private equity ghouls. Yes, also to I just want to add to Isaac's point about the libertarian world, is that we actually did try an unregulated capitalist economy in the era that Trump thinks is the highlight of US history toward the end of the 19th century. And not only was it brutal for the poor, it gave you insane boom bust cycles that basically, as we say on the left, that FDR saved capitalism from itself. that otherwise, as Elizabeth Warren will tell you, every 15, 20 years, everything's going to crash to the ground, and there will be nothing to stop the fall. One more, I want to make a principled point first about internal, external affairs. We are talking about these incursions of the federal government. I want to make sure that it's clear, at least from my perspective, that this is a matter of principle and not of party. That in fact, in the alternate universe in which President Ocasio-Cortez is making her demands on universities, that is every bit as illegitimate as what Trump would do. I might like those demands more, but I do not want the federal government interfering with the intellectual autonomy of universities. That is not what universities are. When it is what universities are, then you've got Hungary, then you've got Turkey, then you've got, you've got something that is profoundly un-American and profoundly authoritarian, which leads me back to international students. I closed my book, What's Liberal About the Liberal Arts? That was a book written in 2006. I noted also that Paul mentioned my 1995 edited collection, Higher Education Under Fire, to which 2025 has been saying, hold my beer. But I closed the 2006 book by saying that one reason that the cultural right hates universities is because they work. We had a trade surplus with international students. We were the envy of the world. There was nothing like American universities for any aspiring ambitious student around the world, and that's what they want to kill. Yeah, and my argument at the end of that book was they hate it for the same reason they hate Social Security. It works. It keeps people from dying and needing cat food in their 70s, and I think none of the attacks, nothing is clearer about these attacks than the attempt to drive away international students. That is really a major chapter in the history of own foot shootings has yet to be written. And again, it's of course it's rooted in xenophobia and the idea that we're training people on H-1B visas to come take American jobs. But here's a case where someone needs to step in and save that aspect of capitalism from itself, right? It is about capitalism and it is about globalization, but it is also about a demographic diversity in American universities that had been, I think, in many ways, very beneficial. It certainly changed State College, Pennsylvania, which went from 2% international students when I got here to about 13% 5 years ago. And most of that has been East Asian, not so much South Asian, but the point remains that this was in one way, a sort of force for cosmopolitanism and for a introduction of student populations that otherwise, certainly in Penn State's history before 2000, just didn't exist when this was almost an all-white place.
So I realize that we have kind of just 5 minutes or less left, and I want to kind of pick up a little bit on the kind of possibilities of what people can do a little bit. And Isaac mentioned Chris Newfield, and I just read it. He just had a piece that came out this month that I thought was really quite interesting in terms of thinking about the challenge the dilemma that academics, and this goes a little bit to the question that Lauren brought up as well about kind of tenured versus untenured and the people in positions of power, that they're too often to be willing to pursue private agency versus kind of collective agency, and that at the end of this piece, he essentially called on kind of a radical revision in which academics should pursue direct control of universities. In some ways, this picks up on some of the stuff that Michael has been writing about and thinking about. And so I guess part of this is in terms of these efforts within universities, is there kind of hope for that in terms of, this is a different way of thinking about this inside outside question. But is there a possibility for academics to seize the reins, as it were, and is that a kind of a possibility? And maybe that kind of aspirational question is a way we can kind of give all of you a last word to think about how we go forward.
Sounds good to me. Let's do it. I think it's going to be an uphill battle. So, we should be clear about that. But yeah, that is ideal.
I forgot that I wanted to say something about that. This is a collective action problem. And a lot of external observers have been like, why in the world are university presidents not forming consortium? Why are we not acting collectively on this? And I think part of the answer is that we've been so decentralized for so long. So, sort of, as Isaac said, so sui generis and so weird that we don't know how to act collectively. But that is exactly what we're going to have to do. That's why I think that even one agreement with this compact would be deadly. Now, I also want to throw in Penn America, even though they're not an academic organization. Among the people I look to, aside from the AAUP and now the AAUP, of course, reading the tea leaves, decided we need to be bigger, and so joined up with the American Federation of Teachers, also forming a bridge, to any number of K-12 institutions. But nothing else will survive. I mean, again, no anticipatory obedience, but also no one should be going this alone. This is a frontal assault on every front. So seriously, trying to find some way from the faculty on up to act collectively. It's, I think, the only way out.
I would add to that from the students and staff on up too, because I think the most courageous people on campus the last few years have been students who've been protesting genocide in Gaza. And I think that kind of moral clarity and that kind of commitment to a livable future and a possible future, I think is something that we should take very, very, very seriously. And that, and I mean, I think that what's really at stake, I mean, like higher education is at stake, but higher education is under attack because it's in a pillar of democracy. And I think that, as scholars, as Americans, as human beings, we have to decide, do we want to live in a democratic world or not? And if we do, then we have to organize that politically because there's political forces that are organized to make sure that we don't live in a democratic world. I mean, these tech billionaires are authoritarians. There's white supremacists and Nazis who explicitly do not want us to live in a democratic world. So I think that there is both a way in which lots of different people can come together to defend higher education at the same time as defending democracy. But I think that as all democratic movements have shown us, that cannot come from the top. We shouldn't be looking to the leaders. They're always going to sell us out. And maybe they won't do as much harm as they could. But even FDR, right? He didn't do as much. I mean, he did what he did because of the incredible pressure that was coming from the top. And I think in this moment, the response to the compact, the fact that nobody has signed on to it is because, unlike 6 months ago, you have, as soon as that compact came out, the AAUP got together and hosted meetings with all of the leadership from those 9 institutions. You have labor unions, you have organizations like Penn, you have the AACNU writing statements. You have this incredible network of scholars that has emerged on this issue, like in the EDU coalition, that is just generating op-eds and opinion pieces and like 1,000 Substacks, and just like that the public debate on the compact, with the exception of the 2 pieces in the Chronicle, right, has been like overwhelmingly very critical analysis that's been sharp and clear and produced very quickly, and is getting into the hands of AAUP, AFT, SEIU, grad student unions. It's getting, and those are networks that they existed but were fragile and are becoming more and more robust. And as we continue to push back, I'm optimistic in a hesitant way, but we should never expect. I mean, I think that a participatory obedience and compliance is one thing, but I think that there's also a complicity among many leaders in the university, like that it's not just that they're scared, it's that they're actually actively complicit. Oftentimes at the board level, and sometimes at the leadership level, all too happy to get rid of diversity, equity, and inclusion, all too happy to get rid of those problematic departments in the humanities and the critical studies, and so I think that like being very clear that any strength that a university president gets will either be because they're like President Roth at a Slack, or because there is incredible pressure from the bottom. I want every university president to look at the Trump administration and then to look at their unions and AAUP chapters and faculty organizers and students and staff unions and to say, oh, crap, I'm going to risk pissing the president off because I'm more scared of these people here, of what they can do and the political power that they yield, and just based on the gains that we've made in the last 6 months, I think that kind of world in which there's so much upper pressure being pushed on presidents, trustees, boards, the broader public in the name of a more democratic society, I don't think that that's unreasonable.
Thank you. I do. That's a nice place to end. And I do think this kind of shout out to students, kind of student newspapers, and all of that are doing incredible work in terms of putting pressure on faculty and on tenured faculty and those of us who are in positions of relative privilege, that we too need to be putting pressure on those around us and above us, if these are things that we value, and that these are questions we need to ask ourselves. Where do we stand with regard to democracy? Where do we stand with regard to intellectual work? And what are we willing to fight for? I think that even though we didn't quite get to all of the questions in the chat, we have reached the end of our time. It has been an absolutely stimulating conversation. I am very grateful to our three panelists who have been incredibly insightful and have engaged each other wonderfully. I feel like I've learned a lot. And even though we could probably continue on for another hour and a half or so, I think we are at the end of our evening. So thank you all for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you either online or in person at the next event of the Lepage Center.